"You will regret this marriage," said Gideon Ashworth, Duke of Halloway, in a low, grim voice pitched for the woman beside him alone, as they stood before the altar of St. Anselm's with the whole of society at their backs. "I give you my word on it. You have trapped yourself as surely as you have trapped me, and one morning not far off you will wake in my cold house and understand what you have done, and you will regret it to the end of your days." Cordelia Vane, who was in that same moment becoming the Duchess of Halloway, turned her head and looked up at him, and she was not pale, and she was not trembling, and she was not, as any sensible woman being married against her will to a man who despised her ought to have been, afraid. She was smiling. It was a small, private, entirely composed smile, and it reached her eyes, which were a clear and unrepentant hazel, and she said, in a voice as low as his and a good deal warmer, "I never regret, your grace. It is my one great extravagance. I should recommend it to you, but I suspect you have not the constitution for it." And then the clergyman, who had heard none of this, said the words that bound them, and Gideon Ashworth found himself married to a woman he had known for 11 days, disliked for 10 of them, and could not, try as he might, stop looking at. It had begun, as the worst things in his life had always begun, at a house party he had not wished to attend. He had gone to Marchmont only because his sister was there. Lady Sophia Ashworth, 19, his ward since their parents died, headstrong and clever, and lonely in the particular way of a girl raised by a brother 12 years her elder who did not know how to speak to her, had accepted the invitation of the Marchmont set against his advice, and Gideon, distrusting the set and the season and the whole glittering machinery of matchmaking, had followed her there to keep an eye on her. He did not enjoy house parties. He did not enjoy much of anything since the business with Miss Devereux 3 years before, which had taught him what the affection of a beautiful woman was worth when a richer man appeared, and had frozen in him whatever warmth had survived his parents' death. He was called the Duke of Winter behind his back, and did not mind it, and had arranged his life to deserve it. He had noticed Cordelia Vane on the first evening, because she had contradicted him. It was a small thing. The company had been discussing the draining of the Marchmont fens, and a fatuous baronet had said something confident and wrong about the engineering of it, and Gideon, who owned a great deal of drained fenland and knew the subject cold, had corrected him with the flat authority that generally ended conversations. And a young woman he did not know, seated halfway down the table in a gown 3 seasons old, had said pleasantly, "Your Grace is right about the sluices and wrong about the cost. The figure you gave is the cost of draining with a wind pump, which fails in a still summer. The figure Sir Robert gave, though he could not tell you why, is nearer the cost of a steam engine, which does not. You are both half right, which I find is the usual condition of confident men, and I say so only because Sir Robert looked so crushed, and it seemed unkind to let a duke crush a baronet over a matter on which the duke was also mistaken." There had been a small, terrible silence, and then the table had laughed, and Sir Robert had looked grateful, and Gideon had looked at the young woman in the old gown with an expression that had made strong men reconsider their words, and she had looked back at him with polite and unmistakable amusement, entirely unafraid, and had returned to her soup. He had asked afterward who she was. Miss Cordelia Vane, he was told, the elder daughter of a clergyman scholar of good family and no fortune, a bluestocking 24, invited to Marchmont as a sort of unpaid companion to the Marchmont daughters, because she was clever and cheap and knew everything, and quite unmarriageable, poor thing, having no portion and a tongue that frightened men, and a habit of being right in public, which is the one thing society cannot forgive in a woman without money. Gideon had filed this away and resolved to avoid her, and had failed to avoid her, because she was everywhere he was for the next 10 days, not by design. He came slowly to understand, but because she went everywhere and did everything and was interested in everything. And a man who wished to have an intelligent word with anyone at Marchmont ended sooner or later beside Cordelia Vane. He had disliked her thoroughly. She was too clever, too quick, too unimpressed. She made him feel, in a way no one had made him feel in years, that his rank was a fact about him rather than the whole of him, and that she was reserving judgment on the rest, which was insufferable. She won an argument from him about the corn laws on the third day and another about the education of women on the fifth, not by cleverness alone, but because she was maddeningly right and had read more than he had, and said so without triumph, which was worse than triumph. He had told his sister sourly that Miss Vane was the most tiresome woman at Marchmont, and Sophia had laughed at him for an hour and refused to say why. And then, on the 10th night, the thing had happened that ended his freedom and hers. He knew now the whole of how it had been done, though he had not known it that night. There was a woman at Marchmont named Mrs. Julia Sefton, a handsome, scheming widow of 30 who had spent the party in determined pursuit of Gideon and his 40,000 a year, and who had watched with growing fury as the Duke of Halloway spent his evenings arguing with a portionless bluestocking instead of dancing with her. Mrs. Sefton had decided, with the cold competence of her kind, to remove Cordelia Vane from the board and to compromise the Duke into a position from which only she could rescue him, and she had arranged, that 10th night, a scheme of some elegance. She had let it be known to Cordelia, through a frightened maid, that Lady Sophia had been taken ill and was asking for her in the East Wing, and she had let it be known to Gideon, through the same maid, that his sister had been seen going alone toward the East Wing library in distress. Both of them, hurrying to Sophia, had arrived instead in a small dark bookroom in the East Wing, empty of Sophia, and the door had been locked behind them from the outside, and Mrs. Sefton had then conducted a party of the most respectable guests past that very door on a tour of the house at precisely the moment calculated for the door to be unlocked again, and thrown open to reveal the Duke of Halloway and Miss Cordelia Vane alone together in the dark. It should have ruined Cordelia and freed Gideon if the tour party would swear she had contrived it, and Mrs. Sefton, stepping forward all false distress, had begun to say exactly that poor dear Miss Vane had been seen to follow the Duke, that one hardly liked to think that a portionless girl might do a great deal to trap a Duke. And Gideon, standing in the doorway with the candlelight on him and fury rising in him like cold water, had watched Cordelia Vane understand in an instant the whole shape of what had been done to her, and had waited for her to weep or protest or throw herself on his mercy, as any woman he had ever known would have done. She had done none of it. She had looked at Mrs. Sefton with her clear hazel eyes, and she had said, in a voice of perfect calm that carried down the whole gallery, "How curious, Mrs. Sefton, that you should know I was seen to follow his grace, when you are the person who sent the maid to tell me Lady Sophia was ill and asking for me in this wing. Was Lady Sophia ill? Shall we send for her and ask? For if she was not, then someone has told two people a falsehood tonight, to bring them both to a locked room, and I find I am very interested to know who, and I dare say these good people are too." The gallery had gone very still, and Gideon Ashworth, standing in the doorway with his fury cooling into something else entirely, had watched a portionless clergyman's daughter, alone, cornered, and ruined, turn the whole trap inside out with a single question and stand there daring the room to disbelieve her. And he had felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not cold and had not yet given it a name, and had been afraid of it. It was worth recording, since it explained a great deal of what came after, exactly how thoroughly Cordelia Vane had discomposed him in those 10 days at Marchmont before the trap closed, because Gideon had gone there a man who believed himself entirely beyond the reach of any woman living, and had come away, though he would not admit it for months, a man who could not get one particular woman out of his head. The corn law argument had been the worst of it, or the best, depending on how a man reckoned such things. It had happened on the 5th evening in the long drawing-room after dinner, when the gentlemen had rejoined the ladies and the conversation had turned, as conversation among landed men always turned, to the price of wheat and the wickedness of anyone who proposed to lower it. Gideon held the settled opinion of his order, which was that the protection of English corn was the protection of English land and therefore of England itself, and he had stated it with the flat finality that generally closed the subject. And Cordelia Vane, seated by the fire with a piece of plain sewing she never seemed to finish, had looked up and said, Your Grace defends the corn laws very handsomely. I wonder whether you have ever been hungry." The room had gone still in the particular way it went still around her. "I have not," Gideon had said. "I fail to see the relevance." "The relevance," Cordelia had said, setting down her sewing, "is that a law which keeps the price of bread high is a very fine law if one owns the wheat, and a very different law if one must buy the loaf, and a man who has never been hungry is perhaps not the ideal judge of which sort of law it is. I do not say you are wrong, Your Grace. I say you are arguing a case in which you are the interested party, and calling it a principle, which is the oldest trick of comfortable men, and I have watched my father bury laborers' children who died of a hunger your fine principle helped to price, and so you will forgive me if I find the finality of your tone a little easier to bear than I find the substance of it." There had been a sound around the room, half a gasp and half a laugh, for no one spoke to the Duke of Halloway so, and Gideon had felt the old cold anger rise in him, the anger of a man whose authority is questioned, and had opened his mouth to crush her as he had crushed 100 impertinent fools, and had found, looking at her clear, steady, unafraid face, that he could not, because she was not being impertinent, she was being right, and he had known it even as the anger rose, known that he had never in his life buried a child who died of a price he defended, and that she had, and that this gave her a standing in the argument that his 40,000 a year did not. He had done a thing then that he had not done in years, which was to lose an argument honestly. "You have the advantage of me, Miss Vane," he had said stiffly. "I cannot answer a woman who has buried the children of my principles. I will not pretend the price of bread is a matter of indifference to a man who owns the wheat. You are right that it is not, and right that I had not weighed it as a hungry man would weigh it. I do not concede the whole of the argument. But I concede that I was arguing it as an interested party dressed as a philosopher, which is a thing I despise in other men and had not noticed in myself, and I am obliged to you for noticing it, though I cannot say I enjoy the obligation." Drawing-room had stared. Cordelia Vane had regarded him a moment with something new in her face, a flicker of surprise and then unexpectedly of respect, and had said, "That is the most honest thing I have heard a duke say, and I have heard 3 dukes speak, and the other 2 would have crushed me and gone to bed pleased with themselves. You are better than your reputation, Your Grace. I did not expect it. I shall have to revise my opinion of you, which I dislike doing as it is a great deal of work." And she had taken up her sewing again, and the conversation had moved on, and Gideon had sat in the fire-lit drawing-room and understood that he had just been paid a compliment that had cost him an argument, and that he had enjoyed losing the argument more than he had enjoyed winning any in years, and that this was a most alarming discovery to have made about a portionless bluestocking in an old gown. He had watched her more closely after that. He told himself it was wariness, the natural attention a man gives to a clever opponent, and he knew it was not wariness. She was not beautiful in the way Isabella had been beautiful, all polished surface and calculated effect. She was something harder to name, a face that was plain in repose and became, when she was interested in a thing, which was most of the time, so alive that a man forgot to think about whether it was handsome. She was interested in everything. He watched her extract from a tedious antiquarian the whole history of the Marchmont Abbey, and make the man feel fascinating in the doing of it. He watched her sit for an hour with the Marchmont grandmother, a deaf and difficult old woman everyone else avoided, and leave the old woman laughing. He watched her lose at cards on purpose to a shy young man who needed a win, so deftly that the young man never knew, and Gideon only knew because he had been watching her hands. She was, he came slowly to understand, the least selfish person he had ever observed, and she disguised it entirely under a sharp tongue and a habit of being right, so that people thought her formidable when she was in fact, under the formidability, relentlessly kind. And this combination, the sharp mind and the hidden kindness, was a thing Gideon Ashworth had not known existed in a human being, and it undid, day by day at Marchmont, some frozen thing in him that he had believed permanently set. By the 9th day he had caught himself arranging to sit near her at dinner, and had been appalled at himself, and had resolved to leave Marchmont a day early to escape the influence of a woman who made him lose arguments and enjoy it, and had told his valet to pack, and had then, on the 10th night, gone hurrying to a locked room in the east wing, because a maid told him his sister was in distress, and found not his sister but Cordelia Vane, and the trap had closed, and the day-early departure had never happened, and instead of escaping Cordelia Vane, he had married her, which was, he thought afterward, the universe's idea of a joke at the expense of a man who imagined he could arrange his own life. And the joke, as it turned out, was on the side of his happiness, though it took him the better part of a year to see it. The trap had failed of its purpose and succeeded of its consequence, which is the particular cruelty of scandal. Mrs. Sefton, exposed, had gone white and then recovered and denied everything, and the maid could not be found, and it did not, in the end, matter. The respectable guests had seen the Duke of Halloway and Miss Cordelia Vane come out of a locked room together at midnight, and whatever the cause, the fact was now abroad, and by morning it would be in London, and a young woman's reputation, once it has been in a dark room with a duke at midnight, is not restored by proving the door was locked by someone else. The world does not care who turned the key. It cares only what door you came out of. Gideon had understood this before Cordelia's clever question had finished echoing down the gallery. He had understood that she had won the battle and lost the war in the same breath, that she had proved her innocence to the 12 people present and would never prove it to the 12,000 who would hear the story by Friday, and that Mrs. Sefton, though unmasked, had achieved the essential thing, which was to make Cordelia Vane a woman no respectable family would receive. It did not free Gideon. It ruined Cordelia, and it left Gideon, a man of rigid and inconvenient honor, with exactly one course that a gentleman could take, which he took the next morning in the Marchmont library with a face like winter. "You know what I have come to say," he had said. "There is no use pretending either of us wishes it. You have been ruined by a scheme you did not make, and I am the instrument of your ruin though I did not make it either, and there is only one thing a man in my position may honorably do, and I have come to do it. I am offering you marriage, Miss Vane. I offer it without affection, since we have none, and without pretense, since you would see through pretense, and I offer it because it is owed, and I pay what I owe. You need not accept, but if you refuse, you are ruined and portionless, and I can do nothing for you, and if you accept, you are a duchess and untouchable and may spit in Mrs. Sefton's eye at every ball for the rest of your life. Those are the terms. I will not pretend they are romantic." He had expected her to weep with relief, or to be coldly grasping, or to make him a scene of gratitude. She had done a thing he had not expected, which by then he should have learned to expect from her. She had looked at him a long moment with her clear hazel eyes, and then she had said, "You are offering me marriage the way you would pay a tradesman's bill. I understand it. It does you credit, in a bleak sort of way. A lesser man would have let me be ruined and gone home. But I am going to ask you a question, your grace, and I want the true answer because I have to spend my life on your answer, and I would rather spend it with open eyes. Do you dislike me, truly? Not the situation, me. Because I can be married to a man who does not love me, half the world is and manages. But I do not think I can be married to a man who despises me and wakes each morning sorry to see my face across his table and lets me feel it. That I could not bear, and I would rather be ruined and free than married and despised. So tell me, do you despise me?" And Gideon Ashworth, who had every intention of saying yes, because it was safer and because he half believed it, had opened his mouth and found that he could not say it, because it was not true, and she would know it was not true, and he had never in his life been able to lie to a person who was looking at him like that. "No," he had said at last roughly, "I do not despise you. I find you the most exhausting woman I have ever met, and you have won 3 arguments from me this week that I did not intend to lose, and you make me feel that my dukedom is a small thing, which no one has ever made me feel and which I do not enjoy. But I do not despise you. I think you are the cleverest person at Marchmont and possibly the bravest, and I watched you turn a ruinous trap inside out with a single question, and I have not stopped thinking about it, and that is the truth, and it is more truth than I meant to give you before breakfast." Something had changed in her face at that, not softened exactly but opened a fraction. "Well," she had said, "that is not love, but it is not contempt, and it is honest, which is rarer than either. On that footing I can build. I will marry you, your grace, and I will tell you now, so that you are not deceived, that I do not intend to be a decorative duchess. I intend to be a useful one. I have run my father's parish accounts in his school and half his sermons since I was 16, and I am good at it, and I will not sit in your cold house embroidering and going mad. You have a great estate, and I am told, a great deal of it neglected, and a ward you do not know how to speak to, and a household that runs on habit and no love. I mean to take all of it in hand. If you cannot bear the thought of a wife who works, say so now, and I will be ruined instead cheerfully. But if you can bear it, I think you will find me a very good bargain, better than Mrs. Sefton, who wanted your money, or Miss Devereux, who I understand wanted your title and took a richer one. I want neither. I want a use for my life, and you have handed me one. It is not the marriage either of us dreamed of, but I never regret, your grace. I told you that at the altar, though of course we had not reached the altar yet. Consider it said in advance." They had reached the altar 8 days later, and Gideon had stood beside her in St. Anselm's and said, out of some last cold reflex of self-protection, out of fear of the thing he had felt in the gallery and would not name, "You will regret this marriage." And she had smiled her small, unrepentant smile and said, "I never regret," and the trap had closed, and he had gone home to his cold house at Halloway Court, married to a woman who frightened him more than any enemy he had ever had, because she saw him plainly and was not impressed, and had promised to make herself useful. She began the next morning. Gideon came down to breakfast at his usual hour to find his new duchess already at the table, already dressed, with 3 ledgers open before her and a pot of tea gone half cold at her elbow, and an expression of deep absorption that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way she had frowned over the Fen accounts at Marchmont. She looked up when he came in and said, without any of the awkwardness that ought to have attended the first morning of a forced marriage, "Good morning, your grace. I have been through your steward's books. Do you know that your home farm has been running at a loss for 4 years, and that the loss is exactly the size of a sum your steward's brother-in-law has been paid annually for the carting of lime that, so far as I can discover, has never been carted? I do not wish to accuse a man on my first morning, but I should like your leave to look into it, and I should like, before that, my tea refreshed. For this is stone cold, and I have been at these books since 6, and I did not like to ring and wake the house." Gideon had stood in the doorway of his own breakfast room and looked at the woman who had been his wife for 1 night, and had already found a fraud in his accounts that his steward had hidden for 4 years. And he had felt the thing from the gallery again, the not cold thing, and had rung for fresh tea himself, and had sat down across from her, and had said, "You have been my duchess for 11 hours, and you have already caught my steward robbing me. Miss Devereux would have spent the morning ordering gowns." "I am not Miss Devereux," Cordelia had said, pouring the fresh tea for both of them without asking, "and you had better stop comparing me to her, your grace, for it does neither of us any credit, and it tells me a great deal about why you are as you are, which is a subject we shall come to eventually, but not before breakfast. Now, the steward. Do I have your leave, or do I not?" "You have my leave," Gideon had said, "to do whatever you like, apparently, which I gather was decided before I was consulted." And Cordelia had smiled at him, the small private smile from the altar, and said, "You are learning, your grace. It took my father 11 years, and it has taken you 11 hours. I begin to think I have married the cleverer man after all." And she had gone back to her ledgers, and Gideon had discovered, drinking his tea, that he was, for no reason he could name, in a better temper than he had been in for 3 years. Halloway Court received its new mistress on a gray afternoon in the first week of the marriage, and Gideon watched his wife's face as the carriage came up the long avenue, and the great house showed itself at the end of it, and saw her take its measure with the same clear unillusioned eye she turned on everything. It was a vast and beautiful and comfortless house. Gideon had grown up in it warm, in the days when his mother lived and filled it with music and guests and light, and it had gone cold when his parents died within a year of each other, cold in the way a house goes cold when the person who kept it alive is gone, and the person who inherits it does not know how. And Gideon had lived in 3 rooms of it for a decade, and let the rest sleep under Holland covers, and had told himself he preferred it so. He saw, watching Cordelia see it, exactly how it must look to a stranger, magnificent and dead. It was warm once, he heard himself say, which surprised him. He had not meant to explain himself. When my mother was alive, she played, and there were always people and fires in every room whether they were used or not, because she said a house should be warm in case someone came. After she died, my father closed most of it, and after he died I closed the rest. I have lived in the library and the study and my own rooms for 10 years. I dare say it seems a cold place to bring a wife. Cordelia had looked at him then in the carriage, with an expression he was coming to recognize, the expression of a woman filing away a fact about him that mattered. "It seems," she had said, "like a house that is grieving and has been let to grieve too long, which is a thing that can happen to houses and to men both. Well, we shall see what can be done. I am very good with grieving things, your grace. My whole girlhood was spent with them. My father grieved my mother for 11 years, and I kept the house and the parish alive around his grief until he came out the other side of it. And he did come out in the end. They mostly do if someone keeps the fires lit while they cannot. I shall keep your fires lit. I shall probably overdo it, and you will complain of the coal bill. Consider yourself warned." She had begun that very evening. The household of Halloway Court, a skeleton staff grown slack and mournful under a master who wanted nothing and noticed nothing, met its new duchess in the great hall that first night, drawn up in a nervous line, expecting either a fine cold lady who would ignore them or a grasping nobody who would bully them, and got instead a brisk, clear-eyed woman who knew, within the week, every one of their names and histories, who found the housekeeper drinking and the butler despairing and the young maids untrained and idle, and who set the whole apparatus to rights not with harshness, but with the plain expectation that a great house should be well run, and that they were capable of running it, which most of them, starved of any expectation at all for 10 years, rose to meet with a gratitude that startled Gideon when he noticed it. He noticed a great many things that first fortnight that he had not noticed in a decade, because Cordelia noticed them and made him notice too. He noticed that the long gallery, which he had not entered in years, held his mother's portrait, and that Cordelia had had it dusted and the Holland cover taken off and a fire lit beneath it, and stood before it one evening a long time, studying the painted face of a woman she would never meet. "She looks kind," Cordelia had said, "and clever. And as though she laughed a great deal. I should have liked her, I think, and she me, and it is a pity we shall never quarrel over the coal bill together. You have her eyes, your grace, though you use them to look colder than she ever can have. I shall consider it my business to teach you to use them as she did. She would want it. Mothers always want it. I never knew mine past the age of 9, but I know that much." Gideon had stood beside his wife before his mother's portrait in the firelight, and felt the old grief move in him, not sharpened but somehow eased, as though the mere fact of another person standing beside it, seeing it, caring to have the cover taken off, had made a burden he had carried alone for 10 years suddenly bearable. And he had understood, standing there, that this was what Cordelia did, this was the whole of her particular genius. She did not remove a person's griefs. She stood beside them, she kept the fires lit, she refused to let a grieving thing grieve alone, and that he had married out of a scandal and a locked room, the one kind of person a man frozen by a decade of solitary mourning most needed and least knew how to ask for. The first weeks were not smooth. They quarreled over the coal bill exactly as she had predicted, and over the reopening of rooms Gideon had grown used to keeping shut, and over 100 small territories of a shared life that neither of them had chosen and both were learning to occupy. Gideon had lived alone in his 3 rooms for 10 years and found the sudden warm invasion of his solitude by a wife who threw open shutters and lit fires and hired new maids and reorganized his existence to be, by turns, an intrusion he resented and a rescue he could not admit he was grateful for. He said sharp things. She said sharper ones back, always, never once cowed, and the sharpness between them in those first weeks might have curdled, in another marriage, into the cold mutual dislike that fills half the great houses of England. And did not curdle, because under Cordelia's sharpness there was that hidden relentless kindness he had first glimpsed at Marchmont, and she never once used her tongue to wound where wounding would do no good. And Gideon, who had expected to be henpecked or ignored, found himself instead, weak by resentful weak, being quietly and thoroughly cared for by a woman who argued with him at breakfast and lit fires in rooms he had kept dark for a decade, and stood beside his mother's portrait and said she would have liked to quarrel over the coal bill with her. And he did not know what to do with being cared for, having forgotten the feel of it, and so he did what defended men do, which was to complain of the coal bill and secretly, guiltily, warm himself at every fire she lit. The steward was gone within the fortnight, dismissed with exactly as much character as his 4 years of theft had earned him, which was none, and Cordelia had the home farm turning a modest profit by the end of the quarter, and Gideon watched the whole operation with a feeling he was slow to identify as respect, because he had not respected a woman in a long time and had forgotten the taste of it. She did not stop at the home farm. She was, he discovered, entirely serious about being a useful duchess, and useful, in Cordelia's understanding of the word, meant taking into her competent hands every neglected corner of a great estate that had been run for a decade by a grieving master who did not much care whether it prospered. Halloway Court had 400 souls dependent on it, tenants and laborers and servants and their families, and Gideon, who paid his bills and left the rest to stewards, had never known a tenth of them by name. Cordelia knew them all within 2 months. She walked the estate in stout boots and an old gown, in all weathers, and she visited the cottages, and she found the leaking roofs the steward had reported repaired, and the drainage that had never been dug and the school that had closed for want of a mistress, and she set about mending the whole of it with a brisk, unsentimental efficiency that Gideon found, watching it, oddly moving, because it was done not out of a lady's charitable condescension, but out of a plain conviction that a thing worth having was worth running well. "You might have married a woman who left you in peace," she told him once, coming in muddy from a morning spent arguing with a builder about the price of slates for the school roof. "You are looking at me as though I have disarranged your entire existence, which I have, and you have not decided whether you like it. You need not decide today. But I will tell you, your grace, that a great estate run without love is a sad and wasteful thing, and yours has been run without love for 10 years since your parents died, and it shows in every closed school and leaking roof, and I do not think you are a hard man, whatever you tell people. I think you are a man who stopped caring because caring had cost you too much, and decided that not caring was strength. It is not strength. It is only a way of being tired that looks like strength from a distance. I am not going to leave you in peace, your grace. I am sorry. It is not in my nature, and you married my nature." Gideon, who had expected to spend his marriage barely speaking to his wife, found instead that he could not stop speaking to her. They argued still, constantly, about everything, the corn laws and the education of women and the price of slates, and whether a duke ought to know his tenants' names, but the arguments had changed key. They were no longer the cold jousting of Marchmont, a proud man defending his territory against an unimpressed woman. They had become something he had no word for, a kind of sparring that left him, oddly, warmer than when he began, a game two clever people play because they have found, at last, an opponent worth the trouble. He began to look forward to breakfast, when she would tell him what she had found in the ledgers or the cottages and dare him to disagree. He began to arrange his day to be near her. He told himself it was the natural interest a man takes in his own estate, newly well run, and he knew, as he had known at the window at Marchmont, that he was lying, and did it anyway because the truth was still too large to look at directly. It was Sophia who first said it aloud. His sister had come to Halloway Court for the wedding braced for misery, expecting a cold brother made colder by a forced marriage and a resentful stranger of a sister-in-law, and had found instead a house that was, for the first time in her memory, coming alive. Cordelia had taken the lonely, clever, difficult girl in hand from the first week, not with the anxious hovering of the governesses Gideon had hired and Sophia had driven off, but with the plain respect of one clever woman for another. She had discovered that Sophia had a real gift for mathematics that no one had ever thought worth encouraging in a duke's sister, and had set her to keeping the school accounts, and had lent her books, and had spoken to her, Sophia told Gideon in wonder, as though she were a person of sense and not a problem to be married off. And Sophia, who had been starving for exactly that all her life, had bloomed. "Do you know what she is?" Sophia demanded of Gideon one evening, having cornered him in the library. "Do you have the smallest idea what you have married, or are you too busy pretending to be made of ice to notice? She is the best thing that has happened to this family since Mama died, and she came to us out of a locked room and a scandal, and you married her to pay a debt, and you are the luckiest man in England, and you scowl at her across the dinner table as though she were a bill you resented paying. I have watched you, Gideon. You watch her when she is not looking. You laugh at things she says, actually laugh, which I have not seen you do in 3 years. You are in love with your own wife and too proud and too frightened to know it, and I am 19 and I can see it from across a room, and it is the most maddening thing I have ever witnessed." "You are impertinent," Gideon said, "and you know nothing of the matter." "I know that you told her at the altar she would regret marrying you," Sophia said, "because she told me, and she told me laughing, because she thought it was the saddest and most foolish thing a man ever said to a woman he was about to spend his life with. She said, Sophia, he warned me I would regret it as though a warning were a gift, as though the kindest thing he could imagine doing was to promise me unhappiness in advance so I could not blame him for it later. She said it was the most defended thing she had ever heard a person say, and that she had decided in that moment that under all the winter, there was a man who had been hurt so badly he thought promising pain was a kindness, and that she was going to spend her marriage proving to him that a person could stay, and not leave, and not turn cold, and that he would fight her every step because he had staked his whole soul on the belief that everyone leaves. She said all that, Gideon, laughing, on the day she married you, and you sit there and tell me I know nothing of the matter." Gideon did not answer his sister. He went to the window instead, the way he always went to windows when a thing was too large, and looked out over the darkening park, and thought about Cordelia Vane saying I never regret at the altar with her small unrepentant smile, and thought about her saying under all the winter, there is a man who thinks promising pain is a kindness, and understood, standing at the window, that his sister of 19 and his wife of 2 months had both seen straight through to the center of him, to the thing he had built 10 years of ice to hide, which was that Miss Devereux had not merely jilted him but had taught him, at the age of 26, that he was a man who could be left, that the affection offered him was always provisional, always for the title and the money and never for himself, and that the only safety was to want nothing and offer nothing and freeze the whole apparatus of the heart before it could betray him again. He had made himself the Duke of Winter on purpose. And a portionless clergyman's daughter had walked into his cold house out of a scandal and begun, methodically, cottage by cottage and ledger by ledger and argument by argument, to thaw him, and he had let her, and had told himself he was only interested in his estate. "She is right," he said at the window, not to Sophia, barely aloud. "I told her she would regret it because I could not bear to hope she would not. It was the coward's move. I have made nothing but coward's moves for 3 years and called them wisdom." "Then stop," said Sophia, more gently than he had ever heard her. "You are not made of ice, Gideon. You are made of a man who was hurt and decided to stop being one. But she is not Miss Devereux, any more than she is a decorative duchess, and she is not going to leave, and the only person in this house who does not know it is you. Tell her. Or, since you are the most defended man in England and will not tell her in 100 years, at least stop scowling at her, and let her see the thing she is right about, before she wears herself out being the only one of you brave enough to have hope." And Gideon, at the window, made his sister no promise, because he did not yet have the courage for one. But he turned from the window that evening a changed man in one small particular, which was that he had, at last, let himself look directly at the thing he felt, and named it, and found that it did not destroy him to name it, and that the naming, terrifying as it was also the first warm thing he had allowed himself in 3 years, and that he did not, though it frightened him past bearing, want to freeze it again. The wager, when Gideon looked back on his marriage, was the thing that turned wary sparring into something warmer, though at the time it had felt only like a duel. It began over the school. Cordelia had determined to reopen the village school, closed these 4 years for want of a mistress and a roof, and had costed the whole undertaking and laid it before Gideon at breakfast, with the expectation of a woman presenting a settled fact. And Gideon, who had grown contrary from a decade of contradicting no one, had chosen that morning to be difficult, and had said that the money would be wasted, that laborers' children did not want educating, that they would be schooled above their station and made discontented and idle, and that he had never seen a village school do a particle of good. He had not entirely believed it. He had said it partly to provoke her, having discovered that provoking Cordelia was the most entertaining thing available to him at breakfast, and she had known he was provoking her, and had declined to be provoked, and had instead proposed a wager. "You say a village school does no good," she had said, buttering her toast with maddening calm. "I say it does a great deal. Neither of us can prove a general case over breakfast, so let us prove a particular one. Reopen the school. Pay for it, the roof and the mistress and the books, for 1 year only. At the end of the year, if I cannot show you 3 children whose lives are plainly the better for it, 3, your grace, not 30, I will concede the whole argument in writing, and I will further concede a forfeit of your choosing, within reason and within the bounds of a lady's dignity. And if I can show you 3, you will concede in writing that you were wrong, and endow the school in perpetuity, and never again tell me at breakfast that the poor do not want educating, which is a thing you do not believe and only say to vex me. Do you take the wager, your grace, or are you afraid of a clergyman's daughter and a village schoolroom?" Gideon had taken the wager because a man cannot be dared by his wife in front of the toast rack and decline, and had regretted it within the month, because Cordelia set about winning it with a thoroughness that he found, watching, first alarming and then irresistible. She found a schoolmistress, a sharp, shy young woman of good sense from a neighboring parish. She had the roof rebuilt. She taught herself 3 mornings a week, and Gideon, riding past the schoolhouse one day and hearing through the open window his own difficult, clever wife patiently drilling a room of cottagers' children in their letters, in a voice gone soft in a way he had never heard her use with him, had reined in his horse and sat listening for a quarter of an hour unseen, and had ridden home in a strange mood he could not name and did not examine. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had to be faced. A new duchess must be presented to the county, and the county had heard the story of the scandal in the locked room, and had come to the first great dinner at Halloway Court in 6 months, that spring, primed to be condescending to a portionless nobody who had trapped a duke, and had gone home, every last one of them, conquered. Gideon watched it happen from the head of his own table with a private satisfaction so acute it was almost alarming. He watched Cordelia take the most pompous man in the county, a fox-hunting baron who had come determined to disapprove, and draw him out on the subject of his hounds until the old man was purring. He watched her turn the sharp tongue that frightened people into an instrument of exactly calibrated flattery, never false, always finding the one true thing in a person worth admiring and admiring it. He watched her manage, in a single evening, the delicate work of making 40 proud neighbors feel that the new Duchess of Halloway was both cleverer than any of them and delighted by all of them, which is the whole art of society, and which most women spend a lifetime failing to learn. And he watched her, at the end of the evening, do the thing that told him more about her than all the rest. The fox-hunting baron's wife, a timid, overlooked woman married 30 years to a loud man, had sat silent through the whole dinner, ignored by everyone including her husband, and Cordelia at the end had drawn her apart and spoken to her alone by the fire for a quarter of an hour quietly, and Gideon had seen the timid woman's face change over that quarter of an hour, seen her sit straighter, seen her almost glow. And afterward, when the guests had gone, he had asked Cordelia what she could possibly have found to say to the dullest woman in 3 counties for a quarter of an hour, and Cordelia had looked at him with something almost like anger and said, "She is not dull. She has been married 30 years to a man who talks over her, and no one has asked her a single question in all that time. And I asked her about her garden, which she loves, and which no one has ever once asked her about. And she talked for a quarter of an hour and cried a little at the end because it had been so long since anyone wanted to hear her. And you sat at the head of your table and saw the dullest woman in 3 counties, which is exactly the trouble, Gideon. That is exactly what is wrong with your whole order. You look at a quiet, overlooked woman and see nothing there, and there is always something there. There is always a garden she loves that no one has asked about, and it costs nothing, nothing at all to ask." And she had gone up to bed, leaving him at the foot of the stairs, and Gideon had stood there a long time thinking about a timid woman glowing by his fire, and about how he had looked at the same woman and seen nothing, and had understood that his wife saw a world he had trained himself for a decade not to see, a world full of overlooked people with gardens they loved, and that she moved through it lighting fires under them one by one. The timid baroness and the drinking housekeeper and the cottager's children and the grieving house, and he was beginning to suspect, the frozen duke who had married her to pay a debt, and that he did not deserve her and had begun, without deciding to want to. There was a game of chess that Gideon remembered all his life, and it was the night he first understood that he was in danger. It had become their habit, through that first winter of the marriage, to play in the evenings by the library fire, and the chess was, both of them understood without saying it, only the argument continued by other means, a way for 2 people who could not stop testing each other to go on testing each other without words. Cordelia played the way she did everything, cleverly and a little recklessly, with a fondness for sacrifice that Gideon, a careful defended player, found first foolish and then, game by lost game, alarming, because she beat him more often than she ought, and she beat him precisely by being willing to give up pieces he would have died to keep. And he came to understand that this was not recklessness at all but a different philosophy of the board, and perhaps of life, in which holding on to everything was the surest way to lose. "You defend too much," she told him one night, having taken his queen with a knight he had not troubled to guard because he had been busy guarding everything at once. "You play as though the object were to lose nothing, and so you lose the game, because a person who will lose nothing can win nothing either. The two are the same coin. You have to give something up, Gideon, to get anything worth having. You have to leave a piece unguarded and trust that what you get for it is worth more than what you lose. You cannot see that because you have spent 10 years guarding every piece you own, your heart chief among them, and you have lost every game of your life while congratulating yourself that at least you lost no pieces. It is a terrible way to play chess. I suspect it is a worse way to live. Your move, your grace, and do try to lose something on purpose just once and see what it gets you." Gideon had looked at the board, and at his wife across it with the firelight on her face and her clever hazel eyes bright with the particular pleasure she took in being right, and he had understood all at once that she was not talking about chess, and that she knew he understood, and that she had been, for a season, teaching him a lesson disguised as a game, the same way she taught cottagers' children their letters and drew timid baronesses out on the subject of their gardens. And he had felt the danger of her go through him like cold water, because a man who has frozen his heart for 10 years is never so near to thawing as when someone shows him, gently over a chessboard, the exact shape of what his caution has cost him, and offers, without pressing, to teach him another way. He had left a piece unguarded that night deliberately to see what it got him, and she had taken it, and he had in the taking 3 moves later won the game, the only game he won from her all that winter, because the piece he sacrificed had opened a line he could not have opened while he was guarding everything. And Cordelia had looked at the board and laughed, the low, warm, surprised laugh, and said, "There, you see. You gave something up and it won you the game. Remember that, Gideon. Remember it when it matters, and not only over chess." And she had swept the pieces into their box and gone up to bed, and Gideon had sat by the dying fire a long time, thinking that his wife had just told him, as plainly as she ever told him anything, that if he wanted to win the great game of his own frozen life, he would have to be willing to lose something, to leave his heart unguarded, to sacrifice the safety he had built 10 years to keep, and that he was not, yet, brave enough to do it, and that he was beginning, dangerously, to want to be. The winter deepened, and the marriage with it, into something neither of them named. They spent their days apart and their evenings together, and the evenings grew, without either of them arranging it, into the best hours of Gideon's day, the hours he found himself waiting for through the tedious business of the estate. They read to each other, sometimes, Cordelia's Choice, which ran to travels and history, and the occasional scandalous novel she pretended to disdain and plainly enjoyed. They argued still, always, about everything, but the arguing had become a kind of intimacy, a language private to the two of them, in which sharp words carried tenderness the way, in other marriages, tender words carried sharpness. Gideon found himself telling her things he had told no one, about his parents, about the year they died, about the boy he had been before Isabella taught him to freeze. And Cordelia listened the way she did everything, completely, without pity, filing away each fact about him that mattered, and gave him back in exchange pieces of her own history, the mother dead when she was 9, the years of keeping her father's house and parish in grief, the slow discovery that she was cleverer than the world had any use for in a portionless woman, and had decided, rather than break her heart over it, to be useful instead. To pour the cleverness into parish accounts and school lessons and other people's gardens, and to want nothing for herself, because wanting, for a woman with no fortune, was the surest road to grief. "We are alike, you know," she told him one night unexpectedly, looking into the fire. "You froze your heart because it was hurt and mine because it was useless, but it comes to the same thing, two people who decided that wanting was too dangerous and made themselves not want. The difference is that I kept the fires lit for other people while I did it, and you did not, and that is why I am the warmer ruin of the two of us. But we are both ruins, Gideon made the same way, out of deciding not to want. I do not know what is to become of two such people married to each other. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps we shall keep each other's fires lit and never quite dare to want, and grow old careful and kind and never say the thing, and it will be a good enough marriage, better than most and a little sad. Or perhaps one of us will be brave. I do not know which of us it would be. You are more defended, but I have more to lose, having taught myself so thoroughly not to want that I hardly remember how. It is an interesting question. Do not answer it. I only wanted to say it aloud once, so that it should be said that we are alike and that I know it, and that I am not sorry to be married to my own kind, whatever comes of it." And Gideon had wanted, that night, more than he had wanted anything in 3 years, to be the brave one, to say the thing, to leave his heart unguarded on the board and trust that what he got for it was worth more than the safety he lost, and had not, because the winter in him was 10 years deep and did not melt in a night. But he had gone up to bed knowing that he wanted to, and the wanting itself, in a man who had trained himself for a decade to want nothing, was a kind of thaw, and he lay awake feeling it move in him, terrible and sweet, and did not for once try to freeze it again. The thing that brought them, at last, near to each other was not a ball or a moonlit garden but a broken river bank in the middle of a wet October night, which was, Gideon reflected afterward, exactly right, because nothing between himself and Cordelia had ever come by the usual roads. The Halloway estate lay along the river Chelt, and the Chelt, swollen by a week of rain, broke its bank above the low meadows an hour before midnight and came down on the string of laborers' cottages that Cordelia had spent the autumn re-roofing. The alarm reached the great house near 1 in the morning, a groom hammering at the door with water to his knees, and Gideon was pulling on his boots before he was fully awake, and found Cordelia already in the hall, already dressed, already giving orders, because she had heard the river rising from her window and had not been able to sleep for listening to it. What followed was the longest and the best night of Gideon Ashworth's life, though it did not feel so at the time. It felt like cold and terror and mud. They worked side by side until dawn and past it, the Duke and the Duchess of Halloway, up to their thighs in the black water, getting the cottagers out of the flooding lanes and up to the high ground in the barns. And Gideon carried old men on his back through water that would have taken a horse off its feet. And Cordelia, who knew every family by name because she had spent the autumn learning them, went cottage by cottage counting heads, refusing to let a single soul be forgotten in the dark. It was she who realized that old Mother Hale, deaf and bedridden at the far end of the row, had been left because no one could make her hear the alarm. And it was Gideon who went back for her, alone, against Cordelia's furious command that he not, into water gone chest-deep and rising, and brought the old woman out wrapped in her own blanket while Cordelia stood on the high bank with a lantern, and a face he had never seen her wear, white with a fear that was not for herself. When he came up out of the water with Mother Hale in his arms and set her safe in the cart and turned, Cordelia struck him. Not hard, a flat furious blow against his sodden chest with the heel of her hand, and then she had fisted both hands in his ruined coat and was not striking him at all but holding on, shaking, and she said, in a voice from which every trace of her composure had gone, do not ever do that again. You went back into that water alone, and I stood on this bank and I thought, if it takes him I will have to live the rest of my life having watched, and I could not have borne it, do you hear me? I could not have borne it. And I have only just found out that I could not have borne it, standing here with this lantern like a fool. So do not ever, and she stopped, because she had heard herself and Gideon, standing dripping in the gray dawn light with the flood roaring behind him and his wife's hands fisted in his coat, understood that Cordelia Vane, who never regretted, who was afraid of nothing, who had turned a ruinous trap inside out with a single question, was afraid of exactly one thing in the world, and it was losing him, and she had not known it either until this moment, and it had undone her composure as nothing in 6 months of marriage had. He put his hand over both of her fisted hands gently and held them against his chest and said, I am here. I am not going anywhere. I have no intention of drowning, Cordelia. I am far too proud. It would be a most undignified way for a duke to end, and the newspapers would be unkind. And she gave a wet, furious laugh that was half a sob and let go of his coat and stepped back and reassembled her composure visibly, piece by piece, and said, You are impossible and cold, and you have ruined a good coat, and if you frighten me like that again, I shall drown you myself and save the river the trouble. And turned away to give more orders, and Gideon stood in the dawn and watched her go and knew, with a certainty that was almost peace, that he loved her, and that she loved him. And that both of them were far too defended, and too proud and too frightened to say so, and that the saying, when it came, would have to be earned by one of them being braver than either had yet managed to be. They saved every soul in the flooded row. Not one was lost, not Mother Hale, not a child, not so much as a dog. The cottages themselves were ruined, the autumn's re-roofing washed away, and Cordelia wept over that once briefly in the barn where they had gathered the cottagers, wept over the wasted work, and then dried her eyes and began at once to organize dry blankets and hot broth, and the rebuilding, because grief in Cordelia was always brief and always turned at once into use. And Gideon, watching her move among the frightened families she had spent the autumn learning to love, doing the plain, competent work of comfort, thought that he had been given, out of a scandal and a locked room, the one thing he had believed for 3 years that he could never have, which was a person who stayed, who ran into the flood instead of away from it, who fisted her hands in his coat and could not bear to lose him. And he thought that he did not deserve it, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to. The flood drew them closer in the weeks after, as shared disaster does. They rebuilt the row together better than before on higher ground, and the tenants, who had begun the year with a distant cold master and a stranger duchess, ended it devoted to both, and Halloway Court, which had run for a decade without love, ran now on a great deal of it. Gideon found himself, that late autumn, happier than he could remember being, and it was a specific and dangerous happiness, the happiness of a defended man who has begun to lay down his defenses. And he knew that a defended man is never so much at risk as in the moment he begins to hope, and he hoped anyway, because Cordelia had taught him, without ever saying it in words, that hope was not the coward's move. The coward's move was the winter he had lived in for 3 years. He came very near to telling her, one evening in November by the library fire. They had fallen into the habit of sitting there after dinner, she with the estate accounts and he with a book he was not reading, and the silence between them had grown, over the autumn, from the wary silence of strangers into the deep companionable quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill it. And that evening the firelight was on her face as she frowned over the ledgers, and Gideon set down his unread book and said, "Cordelia," in a voice that made her look up because it was not his sparring voice, and for a moment the whole room was very still, and he saw in her face that she knew what he was going to say and was not going to help him say it, was going to make him be brave, was watching him with her clear hazel eyes and her heart, for once, entirely open in them. And in that moment, the worst possible moment, the footman came in with the evening post, and the spell broke and Gideon took his letters, and among them was a letter that would nearly undo everything, though he did not know it yet. A letter in a hand he had not seen in 3 years, franked from London, sealed with a crest he had once thought he would marry into. He did not open it before Cordelia. He put it in his pocket, and the moment by the firelight was gone, and he cursed the post and the footman and his own cowardice, and did not know, putting the letter in his pocket, that Cordelia had seen the crest, and recognized it, because she made it her business to know everything, and knew whose it was, and had watched her husband put a letter from Miss Devereux in his pocket unopened at the exact instant he had been about to tell her something with the firelight on his face, and had drawn from it, with her quick, clever mind that was for once entirely wrong, precisely the conclusion that would break both their hearts. The rebuilding of the flooded row took the whole of that autumn, and Gideon, who had left such matters to stewards all his life, worked at it himself beside his wife, and discovered in the work a satisfaction he had not known was available to a duke. They built the new cottages on higher ground, better than the old, with the dry, warm rooms Cordelia insisted on, and Gideon, who had once grudged the coal bill, now paid for without a murmur, because he had carried old men through chest-deep water and could not afterward grudge them a dry hearth. The cottagers, who had begun the year with a cold, distant master, worked alongside him and lost their fear of him, and Gideon, who had been the Duke of Winter, found himself hailed by name across a building site by a laborer wanting his opinion on the set of a doorframe, and gave it and was obeyed, and went home that night oddly happy, and understood that he had spent 10 years being feared and had never once, until Cordelia, been simply useful to the people who depended on him. And that useful was warmer than feared, and he had not known it, and she had. There was an evening near the end of the rebuilding that Gideon kept. The last cottage was roofed, and the family moved back in, old Mother Hale among them, restored to her own hearth, and the whole row had gathered in the autumn dusk to see it done, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was, in the muddy lane before the new cottages, a small rough impromptu dance, laborers and their wives and their children turning in the last light. And Cordelia had been pulled into it, laughing, by a shy young man too overawed to refuse a duchess and too merry to help himself, and Gideon had stood at the edge of the lane and watched his wife dance in the mud in an old gown with the cottagers she had saved, her hair coming down, her face alight, and had felt something in his chest crack open that had been sealed for 10 years. She had come to him after, breathless, and taken his hand, mud and all, and said, "Dance, your grace. You have not danced since I have known you, and I begin to think you cannot, and it will not do for a duke to be unable to dance in his own village. Come. No one here will laugh at you, they love you now, you carried Mother Hale out of the flood, you may dance like a bear and they will call it fine." And Gideon, who had not danced since Isabella, who had thought that particular pleasure frozen dead in him with the rest, had let his wife pull him into the muddy lane, and had danced, badly in the autumn dusk, to a fiddle, with the cottagers turning around them and the new cottages warm behind, and had found halfway through that he was laughing, actually laughing, out loud, for the first time in 3 years, and that Cordelia was watching him laugh with an expression he had never seen on her face. A kind of fierce, tender triumph, as though she had won something she had wanted very badly and told no one she wanted. "There," she said when the tune ended low for him alone, still holding his muddy hand, You laughed. I have been trying to make you laugh for 6 months, did you know that? Not the dry, cold laugh you give when you are being clever and defended the real one. That was the real one, I heard it. I shall be insufferable about it for weeks. And then more quietly the triumph fading into something graver. You are not made of winter, Gideon. I have said it before and you did not believe me. Believe me now. A man made of winter cannot laugh like that in a muddy lane. There is a warm creature under the ice and he is coming out, and I am not going to let him go back in, whatever you do, so you may as well surrender now and save us both the trouble. He had very nearly said it then, in the muddy lane, with the fiddle starting up again and the cottagers turning and his wife's hand warm and filthy in his. Had felt the words rise up, I love you, easy for once, natural, the most natural thing in the world, and had opened his mouth to say them, brave at last, the piece left unguarded on the board. And old Mother Hale had chosen that moment to totter over, deaf and beaming, to seize the Duke's hands in both her ancient ones and thank him, at great and tearful volume, for carrying her out of the water. And the moment had passed, as the moment by the library fire would pass weeks later when the post came, because fortune seemed determined that Gideon Ashworth should have to be brave more than once, should have to reach for the words again and again, should not be let off with a single easy declaration in a happy lane, but should earn his wife the hard way, over and over, until the bravery was not a single act but a settled habit of a thawed heart. He had not minded that night. He had turned from the words to comfort old Mother Hale, and the words had kept, and he had walked home through the autumn dark with his wife's arm in his, both of them muddy and tired and warm, and had thought that he would say it soon, that there was no hurry, that they had all their lives. And had been wrong about the no hurry, as it turned out, because a letter with a familiar crest was already on its way, and the words he had let keep in the muddy lane would cost him, unspoken, 2 of the worst days of his life before he finally, on a cold terrace, managed to get them out. But that was still weeks off, and unknown, and the autumn night was warm despite the cold, and Gideon walked home happy, not knowing that happiness left too long unspoken is a debt that fortune sometimes calls in. And even afterward, even after the 2 bad days in the terrace, he did not regret the muddy lane, because a man is allowed a few nights of pure uncomplicated joy in a life, and that had been one of them, dancing badly to a fiddle with a woman who had taught him to laugh, and he kept it always, the way he kept few things, whole and shining and his. There was a night, that autumn, before the letter came and spoiled everything, when Gideon Ashworth did a thing he had never done for any human being, and it told him more about the state of his own heart than all his careful reflection had managed to. It was at the assembly in the county town, the great social gathering of the district, which the Duke and Duchess of Halloway were obliged to attend and which Cordelia had been half dreading, because it was the first large public occasion since the wedding at which the whole neighborhood, and not merely the 40 Concord dinner guests, would have the chance to look at the portionless duchess who had trapped a duke in a locked room, and to say what it liked. She had armored herself in her best gown, which was not very fine, and her sharp composure, and had gone in on Gideon's arm with her chin level, prepared to be looked at. The looking was bearable. What was not bearable, and what Gideon had not foreseen, was Lady Framlingham, the widow of a viscount and the acknowledged queen of the county, a cold, handsome woman of 60 who had ruled the district's society for 40 years and had decided, apparently, to make an example of the new duchess. She waited until the room was full and the moment ripe, and then she said to Cordelia, in a voice pitched with the practiced cruelty of a woman who has been being cruel in drawing-rooms since before Cordelia was born, and loud enough to be heard, "Miss Vane that was. Or is it your grace now? One hardly knows how to address a young woman who has risen so very far so very fast. Tell me, my dear, is it true what they say, that you and dear Halloway were discovered together in a locked room, and that the marriage was, shall we say, arranged in consequence? One does hear such things. I only ask because I like to know how to think of people, and it makes such a difference, does it not, whether a duchess is a duchess by breeding or by accident?" The immediate space around them went quiet. It was, Gideon thought, exactly the sort of public cruelty he had once watched at Marchmont and done nothing about, exactly the sort of thing his whole cold order specialized in. And he waited in the frozen instant for Cordelia to defend herself, because she always defended herself. She turned traps inside out with a single question. She had dismissed Isabella and unmasked Mrs. Sefton and needed no one. And he found in that same instant that for once he did not want her to have to. He found that he was moving before he had decided to, exactly as another duke had once crossed a ballroom without deciding to, though Gideon knew nothing of that. And he stepped a half-pace forward, so that he stood a little in front of his wife, between her and Lady Framlingham, and he said, in the low, flat voice that had ended 1,000 conversations, and never one so completely as it ended this, "Lady Framlingham, you have asked my wife a question, and I will answer it since it is properly mine to answer. Yes. We were discovered in a locked room by a scheme of Mrs. Julia Sefton's, who wished to ruin an innocent woman and trap me into rescuing her own ambitions, and who was exposed in the doing of it before a gallery of witnesses, any of whom will confirm to you that my wife turned the whole vile trap inside out with a single question, and stood there daring the room to disbelieve her, which is the bravest thing I have ever seen a person do, and I have seen men face cannon. I married her in consequence, yes. I married her because she was innocent and ruined by another's malice, and I do not leave the innocent to suffer for the malice of the guilty, which I gather is a principle unfamiliar in the circles you have ruled these 40 years. And I will tell you a thing more, Lady Framlingham, since you like to know how to think of people. My wife is a duchess by neither breeding nor accident. She is a duchess by merit, which is a way of arriving at the rank so rare in this county that I quite understand your never having encountered it. She has done more good in this district in 8 months than you have done in 40 years, and if you doubt it, ask the cottagers she pulled from the flood, or the children she has schooled, or the tenants whose roofs she has mended, or your own sex, the overlooked wives you have ignored at 40 years of assemblies, and whom she troubles to speak to as though they were people. You wish to know whether to think of my wife as a duchess by breeding or by accident. Think of her, madam, as the finest woman in this room, which she indisputably is, and think of the rest of us, myself included, as fortunate beyond our deserving to be permitted to stand near her. And now, if you will excuse us, I am going to dance with my duchess, whom I do not deserve, and you may say what you like of us both. For I find, having spent 10 years fearing exactly this sort of talk, that I no longer care for it in the smallest degree, which is another thing my wife has taught me, and the most freeing of all. And he had led Cordelia out to dance, in the frozen silence of a county assembly that had just watched the Duke of Winter defend a portionless bride with a passion no one had known he possessed. And Lady Framlingham had been left standing alone with her cruelty unanswered, which is the one thing the cruel of the drawing-rooms cannot survive, being answered squarely and left standing. And her 40-year reign over the district's society was, though no one quite marked the hour, over from that night, because a queen of assemblies who has been publicly and comprehensively bettered by a duke defending his wife does not recover her throne. Cordelia had said nothing at all, dancing for a long moment. Then she had looked up at him with her clear hazel eyes gone bright and unreadable and said, "You did not have to do that. I could have answered her. I always answer them." "I know you could," Gideon had said. "That is exactly why I wanted to for once before you had to. You have spent your whole life answering them alone, every cruelty, every locked door, standing in the middle of the floor by yourself with your chin up, because there has never once been anyone to stand in front of you. I find I should like to be the one who stands in front of you when it is needed, not because you cannot stand alone. God knows you can, but because you should not always have to, and no one has ever spared you it, and I want to be the one who does. That is all. You may still answer them yourself whenever you wish. But when I am there, Cordelia, you need not do it alone. That is what I have to offer you, such as it is. It is not much. It is a man who will stand in front of you at assemblies. But it is yours if you want it." And Cordelia had not answered, dancing, because her eyes were too full. But she had held his hand a little tighter, and Gideon had understood that he had said, without meaning to, a truer thing than any declaration, and that she had heard it. And it was, he thought long afterward, the real beginning of the end of the winter, that night at the assembly, weeks before the terrace, the night he first learned the plain, warm joy of standing in front of someone he loved, and found it worth more than all the cold safety of standing, as he had stood for 10 years, magnificently and uselessly, alone. The letter, when Gideon read it alone in his study an hour later, made him cold in a way he had not been cold in months. It was from Isabella Devereux, now Isabella Lady Caro, the woman who had jilted him 3 years before for a marquis older and richer than a duke. And the marquis, the letter informed him with a delicate and practiced pathos, had died in the spring, leaving her a widow of considerable fortune, and she wrote considerable regret. She had heard of his marriage. She hoped he was happy, though she confessed she could not quite wish it, for she had thought of him often these 3 years and had come to understand, too late, that in choosing rank over affection she had made the great mistake of her life. She was in London for the winter. She would be at the Ashworth cousins' Christmas gathering, to which she knew he was engaged. She hoped, she wrote, that they might speak as old friends with no impropriety, only that a woman who had wronged a man might have the chance to say she knew it. And she remained always his Isabella. Gideon sat with the letter a long time, and felt, reading it, not the old wound reopening but a strange clarity, as though he were looking at a coat he had once worn and could not now imagine having chosen. 3 years ago the letter would have destroyed him or exalted him. Now it did neither. He read Isabella's pretty regret and heard, under it, the same thing he had always heard in her and been too young and too wounded to name: calculation. She had chosen a marquis for his fortune, and the marquis was dead, and now a duke she had discarded was married to a portionless nobody, and Isabella, Lady Caro, wanted her old conquest back, or at least wanted to know she could have him, because a woman like Isabella needed to be wanted by the men she had thrown away. It was Mrs. Sefton's scheme in a silk glove. Gideon understood it completely, and felt nothing but a distant, weary distaste, and understood, sitting there, the full measure of how far Cordelia had brought him, because 3 years ago this letter would have been the most important thing in the world, and now it was merely tiresome. And the reason was asleep in the room above him, with estate ledgers on her nightstand and mud from a flooded meadow still, probably, under her fingernails. He resolved to answer Isabella coldly and briefly, and to think no more of it, and to tell Cordelia the whole of it in the morning, and to finish, in the morning, by the daylight, what he had been about to say by the firelight. He should have told her that night. He did not, out of the last remnant of his old cowardice, out of a wish to have the thing settled cleanly before he spoke of it, and the delay of a single night was very nearly the ruin of everything, because in that single night Cordelia Vane, who had watched him pocket the letter and knew the crest, lay awake in the room above, and did the one thing she almost never did, which was to be wrong. She was wrong in the particular way that only very clever people are wrong, which is thoroughly and with excellent reasoning from false premises. She knew the crest was Isabella Devereux's. She knew, because Sophia had told her, the whole story of the jilting, of how Isabella had thrown Gideon over for a marquis and frozen him into winter. She had learned that same week, from the gossip that reached even Halloway, that Lord Caro had died, and his widow was returned to London and rich and free. And she had watched her husband, at the exact moment he seemed about to open his heart to her, take a letter from that woman and put it in his pocket unopened, and not speak of it, and go pale and leave the room. From these true facts she built a false and perfectly reasonable structure: that Isabella, widowed and free, had written to renew her claim; that Gideon, who had never loved his forced wife and had told her so at the altar, was now offered the return of the woman he had truly loved, unfrozen, available, rich; that the thing he had been about to say by the firelight had not been what she had let herself hope, but something else, or nothing; and that she, Cordelia, had been fool enough, standing on a flood bank with a lantern, to let herself love a man who had married her to pay a debt, and now had the chance to be free of the debt and take back his heart's true choice. She was wrong about all of it. But she did not know she was wrong, and she was too proud to ask, because asking would mean confessing that she had come to love him, and a woman who never regretted could not bear to confess a love that was not returned. And so she did what Cordelia always did with pain, which was to freeze it into competence and go on. And the next morning she came down to breakfast composed and brisk, and a small crucial degree colder than she had been. And when Gideon, who had resolved to tell her everything by daylight, came down to find her armored again behind her ledgers, he lost his nerve for the second time, because a man about to open his heart cannot do it to a wall, and Cordelia had put the wall back up. And neither of them knew that they had each, out of love and fear, made themselves unreachable to the other at the precise moment they most needed to reach. It got worse before it got better, as these things do. The Christmas gathering at the Ashworth cousins was a fixed engagement, and they went, the Duke and Duchess of Halloway, into a house party for the first time since Marchmont, and Isabella, Lady Caro, was there, beautiful and widowed and expensively grieving, and she made straight for Gideon with the confidence of a woman who has never been refused, and Cordelia watched her do it across a crowded drawing-room and drew, again, exactly the wrong conclusion. And Mrs. Sefton was there too, for the world of society is small and its villains recur, and Mrs. Sefton had not forgiven Cordelia for turning her trap inside out, and Mrs. Sefton saw at a glance the shape of what was happening, the returned love, the cold Duchess, the misunderstanding hanging in the air, and set herself with real relish to make it worse, whispering to Cordelia how touching it was that dear Lord Halloway and Lady Caro had found each other again. How everyone had always known they were meant, how nobly the poor Duchess bore it, and whispering to the general company that the Halloway marriage had of course been forced by a scandal, that there was no affection in it, that one had only to watch them to see the Duke's heart lay elsewhere. Gideon spent the evening trying to detach himself from Isabella, whose determined public pursuit was exactly the sort of scene he most despised, and failing, because a man cannot cut a persistent woman dead at a family Christmas without making the very scene that feeds the gossip. And Cordelia spent the evening watching her husband fail to detach himself from the woman he had loved, and reading it as she had read everything for 2 days wrongly, and being brave and bright and dying inside. And it was, Gideon thought afterward, the worst evening of both their lives, and the whole of it, the whole miserable machinery of it, turned on a single letter he had failed to speak of on a single night out of a single hour's cowardice. And he swore to himself, watching his wife's brittle brightness across the room and unable to reach her through the crowd and Isabella and Mrs. Sefton's whispers, that if he got out of this he would never again be a coward with Cordelia Vane, not for 1 hour, not for 1 minute. Whatever it cost him, because the winter he had lived in for 3 years had never once hurt like this, and he understood at last that the safety of not caring had never been safety at all, but only a slower kind of dying, and that he would rather be flayed alive with hope than frozen safe without it. The break came near midnight, and it came, fittingly, from Cordelia, because she was braver than he was even at her lowest, even wrong. Sophia saw the whole disaster forming before either of them would admit it, and tried, with the fierce, clumsy loyalty of 19, to stop it, and could not, because the two most stubborn people she knew were both determined to suffer nobly rather than ask a plain question. She had come to them for the Christmas gathering, and had seen at once that something had gone wrong between the brother and sister-in-law who had left Halloway 2 weeks before, plainly on the edge of happiness. Cordelia was armored again, bright and brisk and a fraction too cold, the way she had been in the very first weeks, and Gideon was worse, silent and grim and given to standing at windows, the old winter creeping back into him hour by hour as his wife's coldness convinced him that whatever had been thawing between them had frozen in the night. Sophia, who loved them both and understood them better than they understood themselves, took each of them aside in turn, and got nowhere with either, because each was too proud to confess a wound to a girl of 19. "He carries a letter in his pocket," Cordelia told her, when pressed, in a voice that would have fooled anyone but Sophia. "From Lady Caro, who is a widow now and rich and free and sorry and here. He put it in his pocket unopened at the exact moment he seemed about to well. It does not signify. I married him to pay a debt, and I have no claim on his heart, and I always knew the woman he truly loved might come back to him one day. And now she has, and I am not going to be the sort of wife who makes scenes. So we will be perfectly civil, and I will not speak of it, and you must not either, Sophia, I forbid it. I am quite well. I am never anything but well. It is my great talent. You are not well, Sophia had said. You are the least well I have ever seen a person be while insisting she is well, and you have got it all wrong. I know you have. I know my brother. He does not love that Caro woman. He has not loved her in years. He told me so. And if you would only ask him, but Cordelia had cut her off, gently and immovably, and would not ask him, because asking meant confessing that she had come to love him. And a woman who never regretted could not survive confessing a love that was about to be discarded. And so she armored herself and was brilliantly cold, and every degree of her coldness convinced Gideon further that he had been a fool to hope. And Gideon, when Sophia went to him, was no better. She has gone cold, he told his sister at a window grimly. I do not know why I thought. It does not matter what I thought. She married me to pay a debt, and she has been an excellent wife, and I have no right to expect more, and clearly I let myself expect more, and I was wrong, and she has shown me I was wrong by going cold, and I will not make a fool of myself by pressing a woman who does not want to be pressed. I told her at the altar she would regret it. Perhaps she has begun to. You are both idiots, Sophia had said, with the flat despair of a clever young person watching two clever older ones behave stupidly. You are both perfectly, completely idiots, and you love each other. Any fool can see it. I can see it. The servants can see it. And you are each convinced the other has gone cold when the truth is you have both put your armor on because you are frightened. And you will stand at opposite ends of a Christmas party being noble and miserable while that dreadful Caro woman and that Sefton creature laugh at you, unless one of you has the courage to say a true thing out loud. Gideon, show her the letter. Whatever is in it, show her. Cordelia, ask him what is in the letter. That is all. That is the whole of it. It is so simple I want to scream. Neither of you will do it because you are both too proud and too hurt, and I am going to have to watch you make yourselves wretched for a week, and I have never been so cross with two people I love in my whole life. She was right, of course, and neither of them did the simple thing that evening. The pride and the hurt were too deep, and the party too public, and Isabella too determined, and Mrs. Sefton too gleeful. Isabella pursued Gideon with the practiced persistence of a woman who has never conceived that a man might not want her, and Gideon, trying to detach himself without a scene, only fed the appearance of intimacy that was slowly killing his wife across the room. And Mrs. Sefton, delighting in the wreck, poured her poison into every ear, so that by the second evening the whole gathering had settled comfortably into the story that the Halloway marriage was a hollow, forced thing, and the Duke's heart had returned to its true home in the beautiful widow Caro. Cordelia bore it that second evening with a composure that cost her everything, and Gideon, who had learned to read her, saw exactly what the composure cost, saw the small betraying signs, the two bright eyes, the hand that once pressed flat against her side, and understood, watching her be brave and armored and slowly destroyed across a crowded room, that he could not bear it, that he did not care about the scene or the pride or the 10 years of winter, that he would rather tear his own heart out in front of the whole of society than watch his wife suffer one more hour because he had been too much a coward to show her a letter. And it was that, in the end, that broke the deadlock, not his courage exactly but his love outrunning his cowardice at last, the plain, unbearable sight of Cordelia in pain. And he had gone looking for her near midnight, meaning to find her and show her the letter and say the thing, whatever it cost, and had found her already coming to find him, out on the cold terrace, because she too, at the last, had run out of the strength to be noble and had decided, being braver than he was even at her lowest, to ask the plain question after all. They had reached the same courage from opposite ends of a crowded, miserable room at the same moment, which was, Gideon thought long afterward, exactly right, because they had always been, as she said, alike, two ruins made the same way, and it was fitting that they should find their way out of the winter at the same instant from opposite directions, and meet in the cold and settle it once and for all, under the December stars. Cordelia found him alone on the terrace near midnight, where he had gone to escape Isabella and the heat and the whispers, and she came out into the cold with her chin high and no shawl. And Gideon turned and saw her face in the light from the windows, and knew that whatever was coming, it was the truth, because Cordelia did not deal in anything else. "I'm going to ask you a question, Gideon," she said, and her voice was steady, but he had learned her in 6 months and he heard the enormous effort the steadiness cost. "The same kind of question I asked you in the Marchmont Library before I married you, because I have to live on your answer and I would rather live on the truth than on hope, which I have discovered is a thing that can rot a person from the inside if it is not true. Lady Carroll wrote to you. I saw the crest, the night by the fire, when you put the letter in your pocket and did not open it and did not speak of it and went out of the room white as death. She is a widow now and rich and free, and she is the woman you loved and the woman who froze you, and she is here, and she has spent the whole evening at your side, and the whole of society is watching you and saying the Duke's heart lies where it always lay. So I am going to ask you plainly, and you are going to tell me plainly as you did before, because you cannot lie to me and I would know it if you tried. Do you regret this marriage? You told me at the altar that I would. You were wrong. I never have, not for one day, though I did not mean to tell you that under these particular circumstances. But do you regret it, now that she is free and you are not? Tell me the truth and I will bear it, whatever it is, because I am very good at bearing things. It is nearly the only thing I am good at that you did not teach me. Do you regret this marriage, Gideon?" And Gideon Ashworth, who had failed for 2 nights to be brave, who had lived 3 years in the winter of not caring and called it strength, looked at his wife standing coatless in the cold with her heart in her steady voice, and stopped being a coward, all at once and forever, and it was the easiest thing he had ever done, because she had asked him for the truth, and the truth was the one thing he was no longer afraid of. He took the letter out of his pocket. He had carried it there for 2 days. He put it into her hand. "Read it," he said. "Read all of it. I should have shown it to you the night it came. I meant to. I was a coward, and I have paid for the cowardice with the worst 2 days of my life, and so have you, and it is my fault. And I am done being a coward, Cordelia. I am done with it forever, starting now on this terrace in the cold. Read it. And then I will answer your question, and I will answer it so plainly that you will never have to ask it again." She read it by the light from the windows, her clever eyes moving down the page, and he watched her read it exactly as he had once watched a woman in gray silk read a legal paper, with her whole attention, missing nothing. And he saw her reach Isabella's pretty regret, and her too-late understanding and her hope that they might speak as old friends. And he saw Cordelia's clever mind do in 10 seconds what it had failed to do in 2 days because it had been poisoned by fear, which was to read the letter truly, to see the calculation under the pathos, to understand exactly what Isabella, Lady Carroll, was and exactly what she wanted. And he saw the wall come down out of Cordelia's face, and something else rise up behind it, and her hand, holding the letter, began very slightly to shake. "She wants you back," Cordelia said low. "She wants to be wanted by a man she threw away," Gideon said. "It is not the same thing, and 3 years ago I could not have told the difference, and now I can. And the reason I can, Cordelia, the entire reason is you. When this letter came I felt nothing but tiredness. 3 years ago it would have been the most important thing in the world. A widowed Isabella, free at last, sorry at last, offering me back the thing I had wanted so badly it froze me solid. And I read it and I felt nothing, because I have spent 6 months married to a woman who ran into a flood to count heads and struck me on the chest for going back for Mother Hale and could not bear to lose me. And next to that, Isabella's pretty regret is a candle held up next to the sun. You asked me if I regret this marriage." He took the letter gently out of her shaking hand and, without looking away from her, tore it across and across again and let the pieces go over the terrace rail into the dark. "There is my answer to Isabella. Here is my answer to you. I do not regret this marriage. I regret every hour of the 3 years before it that I spent frozen and calling it strength. I regret that I told you at the altar you would regret it because it was the coward's move, a man promising pain because he did not dare to hope. I regret the 2 days I did not show you that letter, But this marriage, Cordelia, it is the only thing I have ever done that I do not regret. I did not marry you to pay a debt. I told myself I did because it was safer than the truth, and the truth is that I had been half in love with you since you corrected me about the sluices at Marchmont and made a duke feel like a small thing, and wholly in love with you since you turned that trap inside out with a single question. And I have been falling further every day since, over ledgers and cottages and a flood, and I was too much a coward to say it, and I am saying it now, on a cold terrace, badly. 3 years too late to be any good at it. I love you. I have never said that to a living soul and meant it, not even Isabella, and I know that now, standing here, because what I feel for you does not resemble what I felt for her any more than the sun resembles a candle. Do I regret this marriage? No, it saved my life. You saved my life. You walked into my cold house out of a scandal and you thawed me one ledger at a time, and you never once gave up on the belief that under the winter there was a man, and there was, Cordelia, there was. And he is standing in front of you telling you that he loves you, and asking you, not commanding, not owing, asking, whether by some miracle you might love him too, cold and defended and 3 years too late as he is. The terrace was very quiet. Somewhere behind the tall bright windows the party went on, Isabella and Mrs. Sefton and the whole watching world, but out in the cold there was only Cordelia Vane, standing coatless with the torn edges of a letter blowing off the rail behind her, looking at her husband with her clear hazel eyes gone bright and wet. And Gideon waited, having laid down every defense he owned, more frightened than he had been in the flood, because this was the thing he had built 10 years of ice to never have to feel. The moment of standing open before another person, with nothing held back, and no way to protect himself if the answer was no. "You are the most maddening man in England," Cordelia said, and her voice was not steady now at all. "And you told me I would regret marrying you, and you carried that dreadful woman's letter in your pocket for 2 days and let me think. You have no idea what you let me think, Gideon. I who am never wrong was wrong for 2 whole days, and it was agony, and it is entirely your fault, and I have half a mind to make you suffer for it for a year." She stepped closer. "And I love you, there. I have said it which I swore I would not do first, being a woman who never regrets and could not bear to regret a love that was not returned. But you have said it, badly and 3 years too late and perfectly, so I may say it too. I love you, Gideon Ashworth, you cold, defended, impossible man. I have loved you since you could not make yourself say you despised me in the Marchmont library. I saw it then. I saw the whole of you then, the wound and the winter and the man underneath. And I married you to prove to you that a person could stay. And I have stayed. And I am going to go on staying until you are so thoroughly loved that you forget you were ever cold, and it will take the rest of your life, and you will fight me the whole way. And I never regret. Now kiss me, you foolish man, before I freeze to death on this terrace making a speech, and then take me home to Halloway, for I find I have no further interest in this party or in that woman or in any of it, only in you, which is a most inconvenient discovery to have made about a husband one married to pay a debt." And Gideon Ashworth, Duke of Halloway, the Duke of Winter, who had not been warm in 3 years, took his wife's cold face in his 2 hands and kissed her on the terrace in the December dark, and the winter went out of him entirely and did not come back, and behind the bright windows the watching world could make of it whatever it liked, and did, and none of it mattered in the smallest degree to either of them ever again. The road home to Halloway that night was long and cold and dark, and Gideon would not have traded it for a summer's day in paradise, because his wife was asleep against his shoulder before they had gone 5 miles, worn out at last, the armor all laid down, and he sat very still so as not to wake her and watched the winter country go by in the carriage lamp's light, and thought that he was, for the first time in his adult life, entirely and simply happy. He thought about the terrace, about tearing Isabella's letter over the rail, about Cordelia standing coatless in the cold telling him she had loved him since he could not make himself say he despised her in the Marchmont library. He thought about the 10 years of winter he had lived in, and how he had believed to the very last that it was strength, and how a portionless clergyman's daughter had walked into his cold house out of a scandal and shown him, 1 ledger and 1 cottage and 1 game of chess at a time, that the winter had never been strength at all, only a slow, safe way of not living. He had left a piece unguarded at last, on the terrace, the way she had taught him over the chessboard. He had sacrificed the whole of his careful safety, laid his heart down open in front of another human being with no way to protect it if the answer was no. And the answer had not been no. The answer had been a furious tender speech about the coal bill and staying and never regretting, and a kiss in the December dark. And now his wife was asleep on his shoulder with her clever guard entirely down, trusting him with the whole weight of herself. And Gideon understood that this exactly was what she had meant over the chessboard, that a person who will risk nothing can win nothing, and that the thing you get for the sacrifice is worth more, incomparably more, than the safety you give up. She woke as they came up the long avenue and looked out at the great house at the end of it, dark against the winter stars, and said sleepily, "Your cold house. It did not seem cold to me tonight coming up the drive. I wonder why." And Gideon said, "Because it is not cold anymore. It has not been cold since you came. I only did not know it until tonight. You have been lighting fires in it for a year, and I complained of the coal bill, and the whole time you were warming it back to life and me with it. And I was too much a coward to say thank you, so I will say it now. Thank you, Cordelia, for the fires, for all of them, for not giving up on the belief that under the winter there was a man when I had given up on it entirely myself." She was quiet a moment, her hand finding his in the dark of the carriage. "I never gave up on it," she said, "because I saw him that first day in the Marchmont library when you could not make yourself say you despised me. A truly cold man would have said it and gone home. It would have cost him nothing. You could not say it, and it cost you a great deal not to. And I saw in that exact moment that there was a warm creature in you fighting the ice. And I decided, standing there, portionless and ruined and about to marry a stranger to save myself, that if I had to marry a man I did not know I would at least marry that one, the one with the fighting warm creature in him, and give the creature a chance to win. That was my whole marriage settlement, Gideon. Everyone thought I married you for a title and a fortune and safety from ruin. I married you for a glimpse of a warm creature under the ice, on the strength of one moment when you could not lie about despising me. It was the maddest gamble a portionless woman ever made, and I would make it again tonight, 100 times, because I have won it. The creature is out. He laughs in muddy lanes and tears up letters on terraces and thanks his wife for the coal bill, and he is mine, and I never regret." They came home to the great warm house that had once been cold, and what passed between them after, on that first true night of a marriage that had begun 8 months before at an altar with a grim warning and an unrepentant smile, belongs to them, and the door of it closes gently, as such doors should. But Gideon woke the next morning in the gray winter light with his wife's dark head on the pillow beside him and her hand loose and trusting in his, and lay a long while not moving, watching her sleep, and thought that a man who had gone to a house party he did not wish to attend, and been trapped into a marriage he did not want, and warned the woman at the altar that she would regret it, had somehow, by the grace of a locked door and a scheming widow and a clergyman's clever daughter, arrived at the one thing his frozen, careful heart had believed for 3 years it could never have, which was to lie in the morning light beside a person who had stayed, and would stay and love her, and be loved plainly, warmly, without armor, for the rest of a long life. And he thought that he owed his entire happiness to the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and that this was fortune's oldest and kindest joke, and that he would spend the rest of his days grateful he had been fool enough, once, on a 10th night at Marchmont, to go hurrying to a locked room. Cordelia woke and found him watching her and smiled the small, private, unrepentant smile, the smile from the altar, and said, "You are watching me sleep, Your Grace," which is either very romantic or slightly alarming, and I have not decided which, and I find I do not much care because I am warm and you are here, and the coal bill will be enormous, and I regret none of it. Now stop looking at me as though I were a miracle and ring for the tea, for even a happy duchess must have her breakfast, and I have ledgers to attend to. The school accounts will not keep themselves, and I have every intention of winning our wager, which reminds me, you owe me an endowment in perpetuity. I have found my 3 children and 2 more besides, and you are going to concede in writing, and I am going to frame it." And Gideon had laughed, the real laugh, and rung for the tea, and conceded the wager and framed nothing, because Cordelia framed it herself and hung it in the breakfast room, where it hangs yet. A duke's admission in his own hand that he was wrong about the poor and the value of a village school, and though the paper did not say so, about a very great many other things besides, chief among them the entire wisdom of a frozen and careful heart. They did not, in the end, leave the party quietly, because Cordelia, having settled the great matter, discovered that she had after all one small piece of business to conduct before she went home, and Gideon, who had learned that when his wife had a piece of business it was best to stand back and enjoy it, stood back and enjoyed it. Isabella, Lady Caro, made the mistake of intercepting them as they came in from the terrace, all warm concern, laying a gloved hand on Gideon's arm and saying, with a glance at Cordelia that was meant to wound, "Halloway, you have been out in the cold, you will catch your death. Do come and sit with me by the fire and tell me all your news, for we have hardly had a moment, and there is so much I have longed to say to you." And Cordelia, before Gideon could remove the hand, said pleasantly, "Lady Caro, I am so glad to have the chance to thank you. Truly, I have wanted to all evening." Isabella, wrong-footed, said, "To thank me." "Why, yes," said Cordelia, in the clear carrying voice she had once used on Mrs. Sefton in a gallery. "3 years ago you threw over the finest man in England for a marquis's fortune, and you froze him half to death doing it, and it was the great mistake of your life, exactly as you wrote to him this week. But it was the great good fortune of mine, for a man who had not been frozen would never have been fool enough to marry a portionless clergyman's daughter out of a scandal, and so I owe my entire happiness to your bad judgment, and I have long wished to thank you for it, and now I have. You chose a fortune over a heart, Lady Caro, and you are welcome to spend the rest of your life choosing fortunes, but you cannot have this heart back, for it is mine now, wholly, freely given and freely kept, and no widow's letter will ever loosen it, and I think you knew that when you wrote, and wrote anyway, because a woman like you cannot bear to have thrown away a thing she can no longer have. I am sorry for you. I mean it. I am not being cruel, I am past being cruel, I have everything, and you have a fortune and a great deal of regret, and I would not change places with you for the world. Now I am taking my husband home. Do enjoy the rest of the party." It was, Gideon thought, watching Isabella's beautiful face go through several expensive expressions and settle on none, the neatest execution he had ever witnessed, done without a raised voice or an unkind word, and yet complete. And it was witnessed, as such things always are, by exactly the people who mattered, including Mrs. Sefton, who had been hovering to enjoy the Duchess's humiliation, and found herself instead a spectator at the Duchess's triumph, and who understood, watching, that the woman she had tried to ruin in a gallery at Marchmont had married a duke, mended his estate, won his heart, and now dismissed her rival with a graciousness that was more devastating than any insult. And Mrs. Sefton, who had schemed for a fortune and a duke and got neither, faded back into the party and was not socially ever quite the same, for the story that went out from that Christmas was not the story she had tried to tell but the far better one of the Duke of Winter thawed by a portionless bluestocking, which society enjoyed enormously and repeated for years and adjusted, in the retelling, so that everyone had always known the Halloway marriage was a great love match, which by then it plainly was. They went home to Halloway that night, and the winter of the roads was nothing to them, wrapped in the one carriage, and Gideon found that his wife, having conquered a river and a rival and her own pride all in 1 week, was at last content to be, for a little while, simply held, and he held her, all the long cold road home, and thought that he had gone to a house party he did not wish to attend, and been trapped into a marriage he did not want, and told the woman at the altar she would regret it, and that it had been the most fortunate calamity of his life, and that a man never knows, standing in the wreck of his plans, which of them fortune is quietly saving him from. The years that came were good ones, and full. Sophia, who had bloomed under Cordelia's plain respect, made in her 3rd season a marriage of real love to a serious young man who valued her mathematics, and Cordelia, who had arranged the whole of it while pretending not to, gave the bride away in spirit if not in law, and wept at the wedding and denied weeping. The school reopened and prospered and sent, over the years, a surprising number of clever cottagers' children on to better things, which Cordelia counted the truest wealth the estate produced. The home farm turned a profit every year, and the tenants prospered, and Halloway Court, which had run for a decade without love, became known through 3 counties as the happiest great house in England. And the Duke, who had been called the Duke of Winter, was called that no longer, for the name no longer fit, and names that no longer fit fall away. And every year, on the anniversary of the day they had stood in St. Anselm's, Cordelia would look up at her husband over the breakfast ledgers with her small, unrepentant smile, the smile from the altar, and ask him, "Well, your Grace, do you regret it yet?" And every year Gideon Ashworth would set down his cup and look at his wife, at the clever hazel eyes, and the mud that was probably somewhere on her still, and the whole warm, competent miracle of her, and give her the same answer, which was the answer she had given him at the altar when he was too much a coward to hope, and which he had learned from her, and made his own, and meant with the whole of a heart she had thawed and won and kept. "I never regret," he would say. "It is my one great extravagance. You recommended it to me once. You were right, as you are tiresomely often right, and I have never regretted taking your recommendation, which is only fitting, as it was a recommendation about not regretting, and I should hate to prove you wrong on the one point on which I most wish you to be right." And Cordelia would laugh, the low, warm, surprised laugh he had spent a marriage learning to earn, and say that he was impossible, and go back to her ledgers. And Gideon would drink his tea in the warm, bright breakfast room of a house that ran on love, and think that a man who is told at the altar that his wife will regret marrying him ought to pray with his whole soul that she proves him wrong, and that his had gloriously and gone on proving him wrong, cheerfully and thoroughly, every single day, for the rest of a long and happy life, and that being wrong in the particular matter of Cordelia Vane was the one thing he had ever done that he did not, and never would, regret.